Harold Bennett felt a mix of exhaustion and excitement vibrating in his veins as the taxi approached the address he called home. It had been months of complex negotiations and exhausting journeys through foreign cities, where the distance only amplified the weight of longing. With each passing block, his expectations grew. He envisioned the burst of joy from his grandchildren, the tight hugs from his wife Martha, and the warm welcome from Laura, his daughter, whose dinners always gathered the family around a plentiful table. As the car parked, Harold could hardly wait to shed the formality of his suitcase and the weight of the suits that symbolized his work. He longed to exchange all this for the comfort of slippers and the sound of laughter that he hoped would fill the house. With a smile of anticipation, he paid the driver and, with hurried steps, ascended the front steps. As he turned the key in the lock, Harold took a deep breath, preparing himself for the shouts of surprise. However, upon pushing the door open, what he found was a sepulchral silence. His smile faltered, his relaxed posture giving way to mounting tension. The interior of the house seemed to have been stripped of its soul. The hall that once displayed vibrant photos of years of family memories was bare, with only empty hooks marking where frames once told the story of their family. With a heavy sigh, Harold ventured further into the house, his steps echoing against the cold, rugless floor. The silence was a physical presence, almost palpable, intensifying as he explored each room. The living room, the scene of so many birthday parties and family movie nights, was unrecognizable. Gone was the old sofa that embraced the family in its soft arms, and the coffee table over which games and snacks were served during gatherings. What remained was an empty space, a blank canvas reflecting absence, not the life he had expected to find. The disconnection between the home Harold had left and what he now found was disconcerting. Each step revealed more than had been lost, and the disconnect fed a growing sense of alarm. Where were Laura and Martha? And the grandchildren, Tyler and Emma, shouldn't they have been running to greet him? These questions hammered in his mind as he headed to the kitchen, the heart of his home, where the family gathered to share meals and stories. But even this sacred space was transformed, devoid of the human warmth that had always characterized it. In the center of the kitchen, the table was there, but surrounded by empty chairs, as if awaiting the ghosts of laughter and conversations that now seemed so distant. There, at the epicenter of now silent memories, Harold saw a set of unopened letters on the table, each envelope a harbinger of news he was not yet ready to face. Trembling slightly, he reached out, taken by a premonition that the end of this day would be very different from the reunion he had imagined. This moment of hesitation marked the end of his uncelebrated return, a somber prelude to the next chapter of his life, where the answers behind the mysterious silence would begin to unfold. As Harold approached the garage, a sense of unease grew with each step. The familiar sound of the garage door creaking open contrasted sharply with the scene that unfolded before him. Inside, the dim light cast long shadows over the cold, concrete floor where his grandchildren, Tyler and Emma, were huddled together under thin, soiled blankets. The garage, once a place of mundane clutter, now held a chilling tableau of neglect. The children lay there, their small forms barely moving, except for the gentle rise and fall of their chests with each shallow breath. The makeshift bedding was scant protection against the chill that seeped in through every crack and corner of the unheated space. Harold's heart clenched at the sight, pain mingling with rising fury at the thought of his beloved grandchildren subjected to such harsh conditions. Surveying the surroundings, he noticed that the garage was strewn with remnants of better times. Scattered toys, a few pieces of worn furniture pushed to the sides, and personal belongings that seemed hastily hidden away. The air was stale, heavy with the scent of motor oil and forgotten dreams. Compelled by a mixture of concern and desperation, Harold stepped back into the house, his mind racing with questions. Where were Laura and Martha? The silence of the house was oppressive, each room echoing back his own footsteps, a stark reminder of the emptiness. As he moved through the living room, the bare walls and empty shelves spoke volumes of the rapid unraveling of his family's life. The starkness was jarring. The absence of the lively family photos and books that once filled the shelves made the space feel alien, Harold's search led him to the kitchen, where the reality of the situation lay bare on the table. A scattering of letters and documents covered the surface, each envelope a marker of the mounting crises they faced. With a heavy heart, Harold reached for the nearest letter, its edges slightly curled from being opened, and hastily read. The letter, written by Laura, was a desperate account of recent months. Job loss, escalating debts, and financial desperation were detailed in her precise handwriting. Each word resonated with a mother's despair, outlining the drastic measures she had taken to keep her children safe and under a roof, however inadequate that roof might be. As Harold absorbed the contents of the letter, the gravity of their situation sank in. His family was in crisis, scattered and struggling, and he had been oblivious, caught up in his work abroad. The final lines of Laura's letter, a plea for understanding and help, echoed in his mind as he set the letter down, his hands trembling slightly from the mix of cold and emotion. Standing alone in the quiet kitchen, surrounded by the evidence of his family's plight, Harold felt the weight of his next steps. He knew what he had to do, but the path forward was fraught with uncertainty. As he reached for another letter, hoping for some clue on how to begin piecing their lives back together, the kitchen clock ticked on, marking the end of the chapter and the beginning of a long night of revelations. The kitchen table, usually a hub of family gatherings and cheerful breakfasts, now served as a silent witness to the unraveling of the Bennett family. As Harold sifted through the pile of letters, each one seemed to weigh heavier than the last. They were a mosaic of desperation, neatly arranged in Laura's meticulous handwriting, each stroke etched with urgency. One letter detailed Laura's termination from her long-standing job, a casualty of a downturn that had seen many others laid off. She wrote of countless job applications sent into the void, of interviews that promised much but yielded nothing. With each rejection, her tone grew more despondent, the options narrower and the light at the end of the tunnel dimmer. Bills had mounted at an alarming rate. Final notices and disconnection warnings peppered the correspondence like grim confetti. Utilities were threatened, rent fell overdue. The letters chronicled not just a financial crisis, but a descent into helplessness. Harold's hands trembled as he traced the lines of text, each word a heavy blow to his understanding of how securely he thought they had all been. Meanwhile, another set of letters sketched a parallel narrative for Martha. Overwhelmed by the stress and unable to cope with the escalating crisis, she had sought solace in a health retreat, a place devoid of communication technologies, designed as a sanctuary from the modern world's relentless pace. Her letters, less frequent and increasingly terse, spoke of meditation, of therapy sessions, of seeking peace in isolation. Yet even through the careful words, Harold sensed the underlying strain, the echo of a scream in a padded room. As he read, Harold's mind raced. How had the joyful, vibrant home he had left behind transformed into this silent mausoleum of their past lives? Anguish and frustration swirled within him, a tempest threatening to breach the dams of his usually composed demeanor. He stood there, the letters spread out before him like a map of misfortune, charting a course from stability to chaos. Each piece of paper was a breadcrumb leading back to decisions made and roads not taken, to warning signs missed in the rush of daily life. The room felt colder now, the ticking of the clock on the wall a metronome to his rising pulse. With each letter, Harold felt himself sinking deeper into the morass of his family's plight, yet he was determined to wade through it, to find some way to pull them all back to safety. His resolve hardened with the realization that understanding the depth of the problem was only the first step toward solving it. He needed more information, needed to know what Laura had attempted beyond these desperate letters, what actions she had taken to protect her children in the face of such adversity. His gaze shifted to the last letter in the pile, one that looked different from the rest. It was thicker, its edges more worn, as if it had been handled more frequently. Harold reached for it, his fingers brushing against the envelope's surface, feeling the indentations of the urgent scribbles beneath. This was it, the next piece of the puzzle, waiting to be unfolded. As he peeled the envelope open, the kitchen seemed to hold its breath, the air charged with the palpable tension of impending revelations. The secrets within this letter, promised to lead Harold deeper into the labyrinth of challenges his family faced, edging him closer to the heart of the darkness that had swallowed them up. As Harold stood in the kitchen, enveloped by the daunting silence of the empty house, the sudden sound of knocking jolted him from his contemplation. The sharp raps at the door were unexpected, a stark interruption to the somber atmosphere that had settled over the Bennett home. Hesitantly, Harold folded the last of Laura's revealing letters and made his way to the entrance, the weight of the family's plight heavy on his shoulders. Upon opening the door, Harold was met with a familiar face framed by the fading light of the late afternoon. Jack Peterson stood on the doorstep, his features etched with concern. Jack, a long-standing friend of the Bennett family, had always been the kind of man who appeared when trouble was afoot, his timing uncanny. His presence now, under such grim circumstances, seemed both a blessing and a harbinger of further complications. Jack's eyes quickly took in the visible strain on Harold's face, the worry that had set deep in his furrowed brow. "Harold," he began, his voice tinged with urgency, "I came as soon as I heard you were back." The gravity in his tone suggested the news he carried was far from reassuring. Harold ushered Jack inside, leading him to the living room, where the furniture was sparse, remnants of better days. They both took seats across from each other, an unspoken tension hanging between them like a thick fog. Harold's gaze was expectant, bracing himself for yet another blow. Jack sighed deeply before continuing, his hands clasped tightly in front of him. "Harold, it's about Laura," he said, the words heavy with significance. "She's gotten herself tied up in something dangerous. It's bad, Harold, worse than you might be imagining." The information hung in the air, dense and ominous. Harold felt a chill run down his spine as Jack detailed how Laura, in a desperate bid to rectify her financial disasters, had made contact with individuals of dubious character. These were not mere loan sharks or petty criminals. They were people with deep connections to organized crime, individuals whose promises of easy solutions came with perilous strings attached. Harold listened, his heart sinking further with each revelation. Laura had believed she could manage, could keep her dealings with these dangerous entities under control and turn things around for her family. But as debts grew and her ability to pay waned, the nature of her engagements had shifted. They were no longer just creditors. They had become threats to her safety and that of her children. The room felt colder as Jack recounted specific instances, meetings in shadowy places, threatening messages, and Laura's increasing paranoia, a stark contrast to her usual composed demeanor. Harold's mind reeled at the thought of his daughter, the vibrant girl he raised, ensnared in such dire straits. Jack's voice broke through Harold's thoughts once more, pulling him back to the grim reality before them. "She's in over her head, Harold, and I fear for her and the kids. We need to do something." His words were a call to action, a plea for Harold to step into the fray. As they discussed potential steps to extract Laura from her dangerous liaisons, the sun began to set outside, casting long shadows across the room. The day was fading, but the conversation between the two old friends was just the beginning. Harold knew that this reunion with Jack was not just a catch-up between friends, but a pivotal moment that would lead him deeper into the murky waters of his daughter's crisis. As Jack outlined a possible plan to approach Laura and gauge the full extent of her troubles, Harold felt the mantle of responsibility settle around him. They would need to act, and soon. But first, he had to understand exactly what they were up against. Jack's next words promised to shed light on the specifics of Laura's dealings, the details of which would guide their next moves. As Harold listened intently in the dimming light of his living room, Jack painted a vivid portrait of Richard, a man whose very name seemed to carry shadows. Richard, as described by Jack, was a figure well known in circles that operated on the fringes of legality, circles that Laura had never intended to encounter. Yet desperate times had pushed her into desperate measures, and Richard had appeared as a seemingly benign option in a sea of disastrous possibilities. Jack detailed how Richard had initially presented himself as a savior, offering solutions when banks and legitimate lenders had turned their backs. His connections were extensive, his resources seemingly limitless. But his assistance came with strings attached, entangling Laura in a web far more complex and dangerous than any financial debt. As Jack's narrative unfolded, Harold learned that Richard's help was a facade for a sophisticated operation, leveraging financial desperation for illegal gains. Laura had become a pawn in Richard's games, her debt the chain that bound her. The more she struggled to free herself and her family, the tighter the noose became. Richard had woven himself into the fabric of her life, using charm and false promises to mask the menace lurking beneath. The situation escalated when Richard began to demand more than just financial repayments. With the debts hanging over her head, he had coerced Laura into illegal activities under the guise of clearing her dues. The stakes were raised beyond money. It was now about survival. Richard had made it clear that any attempt to escape or defy him would have dire consequences, not just for Laura, but for her children as well. Jack described meetings where Laura was reminded of her precarious position, with veiled threats that suggested her children's safety hinged on her continued cooperation. It was a cruel tactic, using her maternal instinct against her, forcing her to continue in her compliance. The revelation of this manipulation hit Harold hard. The thought of his grandchildren being used as leverage was a blow that shook him to his core. Throughout Jack's detailed account, the room seemed to close in around Harold, each word adding weight to the oppressive atmosphere. The air felt thicker, charged with the gravity of the situation that was unraveling before him. His home, once a sanctuary, now felt like the center of an impending storm, with each revelation another gust of wind whipping against the fragile walls of family security he had tried to maintain. As the evening wore on, the shadows lengthened, and the details of Richard's dealings became darker. Jack laid out the network of connections Richard had, connections that spanned the underbelly of the city's criminal world. It was a tangled hierarchy of obligation and threat, and at its center sat Laura, caught in a vice of Richard's making. Harold's mind raced with the implications of what Jack was telling him. The depth of Laura's involvement, whether coerced or not, meant that extracting her from this mess would be no simple task. The dangers were real and immediate, not just to Laura's legal standing but to her very life. As Jack proposed a plan to intervene, to somehow pull Laura back from the precipice on which she teetered, Harold felt a resolve hardening within him. They needed a careful, calculated response to dismantle the perilous structure that Richard had built around Laura. Jack was poised to outline their first steps, a strategy that would require all of Harold's courage and resolve to execute. The night had deepened, and with it, so had the urgency of their mission. In the quiet seclusion of Harold's study, the walls lined with books bearing witness to many late-night deliberations, a new kind of strategy session took place. Harold, with the determined support of Jack, set about crafting a plan that was both daring and fraught with peril. This was not merely a financial or legal battle. It was a rescue mission, one that stretched into the murky depths of the criminal underworld. Michael Donovan, a seasoned detective whose career had been marked by his deft navigation through the labyrinth of organized crime, was brought into the fold. His expertise was crucial, and his understanding of the legal and illicit intricacies would prove to be their greatest asset. Michael, with his sharp, analytical mind and a history of disentangling even the most convoluted of criminal endeavors, was exactly what they needed. The plan they devised required precision and caution. It was a multi-phased approach, starting with gathering incontrovertible evidence against Richard. This was no small feat. Richard had insulated himself well within the layers of his criminal activities, each layer acting as a shield against potential legal repercussions. Michael outlined a methodical strategy to peel back these layers, using both surveillance and informants to gather the necessary intelligence. Harold listened intently, absorbing every detail. He understood that this was not just about outmaneuvering Richard legally, but ensuring they did so without precipitating a backlash that could endanger Laura and her children further. The detective emphasized the importance of timing and discretion. Any misstep could alert Richard to their intentions, potentially triggering drastic actions from his side. As part of the strategy, they planned to leverage Richard's known associates against him. Michael had already begun laying the groundwork for this. reaching out to his network of contacts within the police force and beyond, some of whom had been tracking Richard's activities independently. Their collective insights would be pivotal in cornering Richard, forcing him into a position where the only way out was through legal surrender. The discussion then turned to the legal ramifications. They needed to ensure that once they moved against Richard, the evidence would be overwhelming and the case against him airtight. This involved coordinating with the district attorney's office, preparing the ground for swift legal action once the trap was sprung. Harold felt a measure of relief, tempered with the gravity of the risks involved. This was about more than just arresting a criminal. It was about pulling his daughter back from the brink of ruin. Throughout the planning, Harold's role was clear. He would be the anchor, the one who kept the home front secure while also providing moral and logistical support. His connections, both social and professional, would be invaluable in this regard. Jack, ever the loyal friend, pledged to be by Harold's side, assisting in any way he could, his resolve as firm as Harold's. As the meeting drew to a close, the plan was set. The next steps involved putting all pieces into place, ensuring that each move was calculated and every participant ready for the roles they were to play. The night had deepened outside, the darkness seeming to press against the windows of Harold's study, as if trying to listen in on the conspiratorial hush of their voices. With a final nod from Michael, affirming their readiness to proceed, the phase of preparation ended. Now was the time for action, for setting in motion the delicate machinery of their strategy. The next chapter of their endeavor would begin at dawn, the first light hopefully heralding a new start for Laura and her children. As dawn broke, casting a pale light over the city, Harold, Jack, and Michael convened in the dimly lit confines of Michael's office, a space cluttered with maps, photographs, and files that seemed to breathe the very essence of countless investigations. Today, it served as the nerve center for an operation that teetered on the precipice of danger and necessity. Harold had transformed himself for the role he was about to play. Gone were his usual attire and demeanor, replaced by the sharp suit of a shrewd investor, his face set in a mask of calculated interest. This disguise was more than just clothing. It was a shield, a persona crafted to infiltrate Richard's tightly knit circle without arousing suspicion. His every move had to be perfect. Every word weighed with the precision of a seasoned actor stepping into the most critical performance of his life. Meanwhile, Michael orchestrated the logistical dance that would support Harold's dangerous masquerade. He had established a hidden network of surveillance around key locations known to be frequented by Richard and his associates. Cameras, both visible and concealed, would track Harold's interactions, ensuring that every exchange, every subtle cue, was recorded. These recordings would be vital, serving as both protection for Harold and evidence against Richard. Jack played his role from the shadows, his task to liaise between the different branches of law enforcement that had covertly encircled the operation's perimeter. His experience with similar high-stakes situations lent him a calm that was reassuring to Harold, a reminder that despite the operation's precariousness, they were not without their own shields and strategies. The morning progressed with tense precision. Harold entered a cafe known to be one of Richard's haunts, a place where deals were whispered over coffee, away from the prying eyes of the public. Here, Harold was to make his first contact with Richard under the guise of discussing a lucrative investment opportunity. The air was thick with the aroma of coffee and the undercurrent of potential betrayal as Harold navigated the delicate line between engagement and investigation. Outside, Michael monitored the situation from a van, discreetly parked across the street, screens flickering with live feeds from the cafe. His hand was ever ready at his phone, prepared to give the signal that would bring the police swooping in should anything go awry. His eyes rarely blinked as he watched, knowing the gravity of what was at stake. The operation ticked forward, minute by minute, each second stretching out as Harold wove his fabricated tales of business ventures and opportunities. Richard, ever the predator in businessman's clothing, listened with a greed-tinged curiosity that Harold exploited deftly. Their conversation, a dance of words and wits, was a high-wire act, with Harold pushing just enough to entice, but not enough to alert. As the meeting concluded and Richard left, seemingly convinced of Harold's interest and unaware of the trap being set, Harold allowed himself a moment of cautious relief. He exited the cafe, his expression unreadable to the casual observer, but laden with the tension of the morning's risk-filled encounter. With the first phase completed, the team regrouped to plan their next move. The information Harold had gleaned would now be used to tighten the net around Richard, setting the stage for a more confrontational encounter. They were moving into deeper waters, where the currents of crime and punishment would clash with the rocks of justice and retribution. As the day waned into the afternoon, the operation's intensity did not abate. Each participant knew that the coming hours would require even more from them, a crescendo of their orchestrated efforts to bring Richard to account. The next step of their plan was set in motion, with Harold once again at the forefront, ready to delve back into the lion's den. As the shadows of the evening stretched across the city, the operation entered its most critical phase. The streets, usually vibrant and bustling, now seemed like darkened arteries leading to the heart of their clandestine endeavor. Harold, Jack, and Michael, positioned in their respective roles, were synchronized in their focus, each aware that the night's events would likely determine the outcome of their entire operation. Richard, with his sharp instincts honed on the edge of his illicit dealings, had sensed a shift in the air, a whisper of treachery perhaps, or a shadow out of place. Whatever the cue, it had been enough to stir his suspicions. With the paranoia that often accompanied the guilty, he decided to make a preemptive move, to slip away under the cover of darkness, evading the trap that he now felt snapping at his heels. Harold, maintaining his guise of an investor, had continued to engage Richard throughout the day, feeding him just enough information to keep him interested, all the while steering him towards the designated location for the evening's confrontation. As night fell, Harold's communication with Richard was a masterpiece of deception, a careful blend of urgency and credibility designed to draw Richard out. Meanwhile, Michael coordinated with the city's police force from his mobile command center, a van filled with monitors and communication equipment parked discreetly on a side street. His eyes were glued to the screens, watching live feeds from surveillance cameras strategically placed along the expected route of Richard's escape. Every officer involved was on high alert, ready to close in at Michael's command. Jack, ever the tactician, had positioned himself as an additional set of eyes on the ground. His presence in the area was unobtrusive, his experience in such operations allowing him to blend seamlessly with the night crowd. His role was to provide real-time updates to Michael and Harold, ensuring that any sudden changes in Richard's behavior were immediately communicated. As Richard made his move, his silhouette a fleeting shadow against the dimly lit streets, the chase began. His steps quickened, turning into a sprint as he navigated the maze of alleys and back lanes he knew so well. However, the team's preparation outmatched his local knowledge. Harold, maintaining contact via a concealed earpiece, relayed Richard's movements back to Michael, who in turn coordinated the police units with precision. The pursuit was tense, each turn and corner potentially hiding an escape or a capture. Richard's desperation lent him speed, but the dragnet devised by Harold and his team was drawing tighter. Police cars subtly herded him towards a predetermined bottleneck, by a narrow lane flanked by high buildings with no exits. As Richard rounded the corner into the trap, his fate was sealed. Police lights flashed to life, sirens wailed, and officers emerged from shadows and vehicles, closing in with a practiced efficiency. Richard's momentary shock at the realization of his entrapment was palpable, the final confirmation of his betrayal rendering him momentarily immobile. This pivotal moment, with Richard cornered and the police moving in, marked the climax of the night's efforts. Harold, watching from a distance, allowed himself a breath of relief, though it was tinged with the weight of what had transpired. The streets, now flashing with police lights, were a stark contrast to the darkness that had preceded the capture. With Richard now in custody, the immediate danger was curtailed, but the ramifications of his capture and the evidence gathered against him promised more challenges ahead. As the police secured Richard, reading him his rights, the operation began to wind down, yet the echo of the night's adrenaline lingered in the air. The next phase would involve interrogations and legal proceedings, a different kind of pursuit in the quest for justice. With Richard securely behind bars, the subsequent investigations quickly escalated, unveiling a complex network of corruption that snaked through the underbelly of the city's elite. The revelations came thick and fast, each one more shocking than the last, implicating not just low-level thugs, but also some of the most respected names in the community. As the details emerged, the case grew in scope and significance, drawing the attention of higher authorities and the media, who were eager to uncover how deep the rot had spread. Inside the cold, sterile rooms of the police headquarters, officers and detectives pored over documents and testimonies gathered from Richard and his associates. The interrogation room, with its stark white walls and a single table, became the epicenter of many heated discussions and strategic planning sessions. Every new piece of information added another piece to the jigsaw puzzle of bribery, extortion, and manipulation that Richard had mastered. Meanwhile, the focus was also sharply on rescuing Laura from the grim circumstances into which she had been thrust. Acting on the information obtained from one of Richard's less loyal associates, the task force discovered her location, a nondescript warehouse on the city's industrial outskirts. It had been converted into a makeshift prison where Laura had been held under strict surveillance, isolated from the outside world and under constant threat. The rescue mission was executed with precision and urgency. Under the cover of night, a team of elite officers, equipped with tactical gear and led by Michael Donovan, approached the warehouse. They moved silently, blending into the darkness to avoid detection by any of Richard's remaining guards. As they breached the perimeter, the tension among the team was palpable. Every officer knew the stakes were high, not just for Laura's safety, but also for the integrity of the operation. They reached the warehouse's flimsy door, and with a swift, coordinated effort, breached it to storm inside. Inside, they found Laura in a small, dimly lit room, her eyes wide with a mix of fear and hope. The space was sparse, the only furniture being a worn mattress and a small table littered with remnants of meager meals. She was visibly shaken but unharmed, her resilience shining through even in the dim light as she realized rescue had come. The officers quickly secured the area, ensuring no threats remained before carefully escorting Laura out of her confinement. The cool night air hit her as she stepped outside, a poignant symbol of her return to freedom. Wrapped in a blanket, she was led to a waiting vehicle, away from the dark confines of her captivity. Harold, who had been waiting anxiously nearby, saw her emerge and felt a surge of relief so intense it momentarily overwhelmed him. As Laura approached, he rushed forward, embracing her in a long, tight hug that spoke volumes. In that moment, all the fear and anxiety of the past weeks seemed to dissolve, replaced by the overwhelming joy of reunion. As Laura settled into the vehicle that would take her to safety, the warehouse faded into the background, a stark reminder of the ordeal she had endured. The night, though dark, was no longer foreboding, but held a promise of new beginnings, as father and daughter reunited, ready to face the challenges of healing and recovery together. The air was crisp as Laura stepped out of the police vehicle, her gaze lifting to the familiar, yet somehow distant sight of her childhood home. It stood as a beacon of past normalcy, the windows glowing warmly in the twilight. Harold, with a weight of worry finally lifting from his shoulders, stood beside Tyler and Emma, who clutched each other with a mixture of anticipation and nervousness. They had been told only that their mother was coming home, not the full extent of the ordeal she had endured. As Laura approached, her steps hesitant yet determined, the children broke free from their grandfather's gentle hold and rushed toward her. The moment they reached her, all the pent-up fear and longing burst forth in a flood of tears and tight embraces. Laura knelt down, her arms wide open, enveloping her children in a protective hug that felt as if she was trying to shield them from the world itself. Her eyes met Harold's over the tops of their heads, sharing a silent vow that resonated deeply between them. Never again would they allow such darkness to touch their family. The reunion was raw with emotion, each touch and tear a testament to the trials they had faced. Emma, the younger of the two, clung to her mother with a grip that spoke of nights filled with fear and days filled with uncertainty. Tyler, trying to be strong but overwhelmed by the reality of his mother's presence, allowed himself to be vulnerable, his usual composed demeanor giving way to a childlike relief. Harold watched the tender scene, feeling a mix of profound gratitude and residual fear. He had fought tirelessly for this moment, the restoration of his family, yet he knew the shadows of their recent past would linger. The road to healing would be long and fraught with challenges, but for now, the simple act of being together was a balm to their bruised hearts. As they slowly stood, Laura leading her children back towards the house, their steps were tentative but hopeful. The front door opened to the living room they had known all their lives, now a sanctuary of their reunification. Inside, the familiar surroundings, the couch where they had watched countless movies, the dining table where they had celebrated many birthdays, awaited their attempt to return to normalcy. The evening unfolded quietly, with each family member taking comfort in the simple acts of being together. They shared a meal, the first as a complete family in what felt like forever. The conversation was light, deliberately steering clear of the dark topics that lay just beneath the surface. Laughter, a rare and precious sound, began to trickle back into their interactions, a sign of resilience and the enduring strength of familial bonds. As the night drew to a close, with Tyler and Emma tucked into their beds, reassured by their mother's presence in the next room, Laura and Harold sat together in the quiet of the living room. They talked about the days ahead, the support they would need, and the love that would see them through. It was a moment of shared resolve, a recognition that while the scars of their ordeal were indelible, so too was their commitment to rebuild and renew. The clock chimed softly in the background, marking the passage of time, a reminder that while this chapter of their lives was closing, the journey of healing and growth was just beginning. As they sat together, the comfort of familiar surroundings enveloping them, Harold and Laura knew that the next steps they took would be towards a future where fear had no hold, and love was their guiding light. In the quiet aftermath of emotional reunions, and amidst the gentle rhythms of a household slowly stitching itself back together, Harold stumbled upon an unexpected relic of the past. It was an old, unassuming wooden box, tucked away in the back of a seldom-used closet. The box was one of those timeless pieces, its surface worn smooth by years of handling, yet it had always been part of the backdrop of their family life, often overlooked and rarely considered. One quiet morning, as Harold was organizing the house in an attempt to restore some semblance of order and normalcy, his hands found the box again. The decision to open it was impulsive, driven by a newfound desire to cleanse the house of any remnants of their painful past. As the lid creaked open, Harold was met not with forgotten trinkets or old photographs, but with a stack of neatly tied documents, their legal verbiage stark against the aging paper. These documents, as Harold soon discovered, were not mere paperwork, but the last echoes of a secret Martha had kept even from him. They detailed a substantial inheritance, one that Martha had received from a distant relative years before, its existence cloaked in a series of legal maneuvers designed to obscure its origins and implications. The revelation of the inheritance brought with it a wave of conflicting emotions for Harold. There was surprise, certainly, and confusion. Why had Martha chosen to hide this? But more overwhelmingly, there was a deep sense of irony and frustration. This money, had it been known, could have shielded the family from the financial desperation that ultimately led Laura into Richard's dangerous orbit. As Harold sifted through the documents, each page turned added layers to his understanding of Martha's decision. It appeared that Martha had believed deeply in the value of self-sufficiency and the dangers of unearned wealth. In her own handwriting, a letter appended to the will explained her actions. She had wanted Laura to learn the resilience that comes from overcoming life's financial hurdles without a safety net, believing it would forge a stronger character. But the plan had backfired, with consequences far more severe than Martha could have anticipated. The inheritance, meant as a last resort safety net for her daughter, had remained a well-guarded secret, one that now seemed a monumental misjudgment given the events that had unfolded. With the documents spread out before him, Harold felt the weight of this new knowledge settle around him. It was a burden, yet also a potential tool for healing. This money could now serve as a means to rebuild their lives, to provide the stability and security that had so recently been shattered. Later that day, as the house hummed with the quiet sounds of a family finding its footing, Harold decided it was time to share the discovery with Laura. He found her in the garden, where she had taken to spending her mornings, the earth under her fingers a tangible connection to growth and recovery. As they sat together, surrounded by the budding signs of spring, Harold handed her the documents. The conversation that followed was a delicate dance around the past's shadows and the future's potential light. Laura listened, her expression a mix of astonishment and contemplation, as they discussed what this money could mean for them now. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across the garden, as they made plans to use the inheritance responsibly. It was a bittersweet resolution to a chapter of their lives marked by darkness, and as they stood to go inside, the promise of a new day seemed just a little brighter. The revelation of the hidden inheritance cast a new light on many of Martha's past decisions, the motives behind her actions now illuminated in a context that was both complex and poignant. As Harold and Laura delved deeper into the documents found within the old wooden box, they pieced together a narrative that spoke volumes about Martha's character and her intentions. Martha had always been the cornerstone of their family, her values deeply rooted in self-reliance and the dignity of labor. These principles, Harold recalled, were often the subject of many dinner-table conversations. They were the ethos she endeavored to instill in Laura from a young age. Now, as they sifted through her last will and handwritten letters, it became evident that Martha's decision to conceal the inheritance was not born out of secrecy for its own sake, but from a desire to see her family thrive through their own efforts, not just through monetary fortune. The documents revealed that the inheritance had originated from a distant relative, a figure shrouded in the mists of family lore, whom Martha had once mentioned in passing as a quaint old gentleman with peculiar habits. This relative had left a substantial sum, intending it to secure the future of his kin. Yet, upon receiving it, Martha had chosen a path less trodden. She placed the funds in a trust, accessible only under conditions she controlled tightly, fearing that its easy availability might lead to complacency or a sense of entitlement. The shock of the revelation was multifaceted for Laura. It was a shock of realization that her mother's teachings on resilience were not just philosophical, but were underpinned by a safety net she had never known existed. Yet there was also a profound relief, a breath of fresh air in the suffocating aftermath of their recent crises. The financial security this inheritance promised opened up new avenues for rebuilding their lives, for rectifying the damages wrought by the ordeal with Richard. As Laura absorbed the information, she walked through the garden, her fingers brushing against the leaves of plants she had tended with such care. Plants that were now metaphors for her own growing understanding and acceptance of her mother's intentions. The garden, a space of growth and renewal, seemed a fitting backdrop for the unfolding understanding of her mother's legacy. The inheritance, while substantial, came with its own set of responsibilities and decisions. How to best use this unexpected wealth. How to honor Martha's intentions while also addressing the immediate needs of their family. These were questions that needed careful consideration, a plan that required thoughtfulness and respect for Martha's original wishes. As evening approached, casting long shadows over the rows of budding plants, Harold and Laura concluded their discussion with a decision to seek professional advice on managing the inheritance. They planned to set up a series of trusts and funds, some to support Laura's and her children's future education and well-being, and others to contribute to charities that were in line with Martha's values. Perhaps something that supported education or provided opportunities for underprivileged youth. The conversation that had started in the shadow of an old mystery was now moving towards a resolution, a plan to use Martha's gift not just as a means of securing their own future, but as a way to extend her legacy of self-reliance and support for the community. As they walked back towards the house, the documents tucked safely under Harold's arm, the air around them felt lighter, the burden of the past slowly lifting as they contemplated the promise of the future. In the wake of revelations and resolutions, The Bennett family found themselves drawn together not just by circumstance, but by a shared commitment to forge a path forward, one that honored both the past and their hopes for the future. The home, once a silent witness to their scattered lives and whispered fears, began to buzz with activity and a sense of renewal. It became a physical manifestation of their collective resolve to rebuild and rejuvenate. Under Laura's meticulous eye and Harold's steady hand, the transformation of their home took shape. The living room, which had seen years of laughter, solemn gatherings, and quiet evenings, was refreshed with vibrant new colors that seemed to chase away the shadows of recent events. Soft blues and warm yellows replaced the outdated wallpapers, and new, comfortable furniture invited relaxation and comfort. The garage, the site of such unexpected hardship for the children, underwent a particularly heartfelt transformation. It was converted into a bright and functional family room, a space for games, crafts, and movie nights. Every choice, from the plush sofas to the cheerful curtains, was made with the intention of erasing the darker memories associated with the space and replacing them with new, joyful experiences. As the physical space around them transformed, so too did the emotional landscape of the Bennett family. Harold and Martha, whose marriage had weathered many storms, found in these efforts not just a renewal of their home, but of their vows to each other. In a small, intimate ceremony in their rejuvenated garden, surrounded by the new blooms of spring that Laura had nurtured, they reaffirmed their commitment to each other. Martha, ever the pillar of strength, spoke softly yet firmly of her intentions to maintain open lines of communication, acknowledging that the secrecy over the inheritance had been a misstep, albeit one made with the best intentions. Harold, with a voice strengthened by recent trials, echoed her sentiments, promising to face future challenges together, with honesty and trust as their guide. Their renewed vows were not just promises to each other, but to their family as well. A declaration that every lesson learned and every hardship endured was a stepping stone towards a stronger, more united future. It was a moment of poignant beauty, set against the backdrop of a home that buzzed with the laughter of children and the quiet murmurs of a family rediscovering its foundation. As the day of renewal drew to a close, the house, brighter and more welcoming than it had been in months, seemed to echo with the new promises made. The air was filled with a sense of accomplishment and a renewed optimism that permeated every room, every freshly painted wall, and every newly planted flower in the garden. The Bennetts retired that evening not just to a house made anew, but to a home reinvigorated with love and a deepened commitment to each other. As they settled in, the challenges they had faced seemed less daunting, their bonds fortified by the vows renewed under the gentle twilight of their own garden. The evening whispered of gentle closures and new beginnings, a fitting prelude to the ongoing journey of their family's story. As the first rays of morning light streamed through the newly curtained windows, casting patterns of light and shadow across the rejuvenated living room, the Bennett family awoke to not just another day, but to a new chapter in their lives. The house, with its freshly painted walls and comfortable new furnishings, resonated with a warmth and vitality that mirrored the renewed spirits of its inhabitants. Harold, rising early as was his custom, took a moment to appreciate the quiet serenity of their restored home. He walked through each room, observing the tangible results of their collective efforts to rebuild. The family room, once a cold garage, now buzzed with the potential for laughter and shared moments, its walls adorned with bright, cheerful art that Laura and the children had chosen together. In the kitchen, Laura prepared breakfast, a routine that had regained its place as a cherished ritual in the Bennett household. The aroma of coffee blended with the scent of pancakes on the griddle, creating a comforting symphony of smells that called the family to gather. Tyler and Emma, rejuvenated by the stability of their rejuvenated home, helped set the table, their chatter and occasional giggles filling the space with youthful energy. As they sat down to eat, the simple act of sharing a meal became a symbol of their restored unity and strength. They talked about their plans for the day, for the week, and beyond. Conversations that were no longer overshadowed by fear or uncertainty, but were instead imbued with optimism and mutual support. Each member of the family, empowered by their recent trials and the lessons drawn from them, brought their own hopes and dreams back into the light. The conversation turned to plans for the future. Laura spoke of starting a community garden project, wanting to extend the healing and growth they had experienced to the wider community. Harold, reflecting on the profound personal changes he had undergone, considered using part of the inheritance to fund local scholarships, aiming to give back in ways that would honor Martha's deep-seated values of education and self-reliance. Throughout the day, as they moved through the rhythms of their daily lives, there was a palpable sense of contentment that had been absent for too long. The children, once burdened by the instability and fear that had shadowed their young lives, now thrived in the security of their renewed family bond and the comfort of their home. As the sun set, painting the sky in hues of orange and pink, the Bennetts gathered in their garden. The space, which had hosted their vow renewal, now served as a testament to the cycles of renewal and growth that defined their lives. They planted new flowers, a tradition they decided to adopt each year, symbolizing their continual growth and renewal. The story of Harold and his family, marked by challenges and fortified by unconditional love and resilience, concluded on a note of hopeful continuity. The house, a mere structure of beams and walls, had transformed back into a home, a sanctuary of love, laughter, and the promise of endless possibilities. The adversities they had faced, now just chapters of their past, had not just tested but ultimately strengthened their bonds, teaching them that the foundation of family, built on love and understanding, could weather any storm. This new beginning was not an end but a continuation, a journey that they would navigate together, fortified by the lessons of the past and hopeful for the future. Ever reminded that in unity and love lies the true strength to not just endure, but to thrive.
So, if you're not subscribed yet, click on the subscribe button below and join our community. Thank you for your support and see you in the next videos.